Okay, today's lecture is going to be about reptiles. And again, some of the cool evolutionary innovations that we see within them that represent another way for life to exploit the diversity of habitats and environments on Earth. And in particular, when it comes to reptiles, we can take the opportunity to describe the particular innovations and adaptations that enable them to get away from water altogether. If you remember from amphibians, they could get away from water much of the year, but they were still constrained to having a wet environment for reproduction. Now, the things that we're going to talk about are the improvement to the heart, which is basically a way of moving oxygen around the body more effectively and getting rid of carbon dioxide for increasingly active animals. So one of the key things that helps reptiles get away from water altogether, apart from needing a bit in your diet, is the amniotic egg. So this is a way of protecting and encasing your egg so that it doesn't dry out. And then also we're going to need to change the way in which excretion works, in particular the nitrogenous waste that organisms use in very dry environments. This is the part of the evolutionary tree that we're going to be addressing today. Now you will notice from looking at this, just as fishes were a non-monophyletic group, that is, fishes were the evolutionary lineage, but the things we call fishes, we colloquially call fishes, don't include all of the descendants of that group, because we had amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals coming off it as well. Now the same is true with reptiles. So the evolutionary lineage that is reptiles is one thing, but the things we call reptiles don't represent that entire lineage, because birds branch off of the reptile lineage as well. You know that we're trying to carry this comparative framework forward through all of the vertebrate groups because they form really interesting comparisons, and so we'll do that again with the circulatory system and the heart. So amphibians, of course, will use respiration through their skin, particularly when they're in the water, and they will also have gills in the larval form, but now reptiles don't have that at all. Instead, they breathe entirely via their lungs. Now, because they're moving into dry environments, they need to conserve water. So part of that means not losing water through your integument, your skin, your epidermis. And to do that, the skin is waterproof with beta keratin. It's not exactly keratin, which is why it's in italics, but it's often referred to as keratin. And they're going to produce this special nitrogenous waste that's more efficient in dry environments because it doesn't waste nearly as much water. And then finally, they're going to reproduce and develop entirely on land, so they don't have to put their eggs or their larvae into wet environments, into water. And so this is going to require internal fertilization. In the introductory video, you saw a bunch of stuff from Trinidad, including the fertilants. So that snake on the upper right there is a fertilants we saw in Trinidad while walking along the streams. Someone had passed in front of us, one of our group, and the snake had been alerted and worried, and now was in this coiled position to strike with its tail resting on the bottom for leverage and its neck curled to be ready in the strike position when we walked right up to it. So in that comparative essence then, where we want to talk about the different types of anatomical features and how they resonate across the different parts of the vertebrate group, here's a reminder of the circulatory system and the heart for fish on the left and for amphibians on the right. If you remember, fish have a single circuit with only a two-chambered heart, and amphibians have two circuits where one goes to the pulmonary system and then one is the systemic system with a three-chambered heart. So they can repressurize or accelerate the blood through both of the circuits. Although remembering that there's only a single ventricle, and so you have the mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood within the heart. So on the left you have the circulatory system of turtles, snakes, and lizards, and on the right you have the circulatory system of crocodiles. Now there's a couple of really key features here. The first is that the ventricle is now becoming mostly divided. So in crocodiles, it's a fully four-chambered heart, so you have two completely separated ventricles. In the turtles, snakes, and lizards, it's partially separated ventricles. So it's really still a three-chambered heart, but you're beginning to see this partition into a four-chambered heart. It's kind of in the middle of the two. So what that means, of course, is that now you don't mix the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood from the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit in the heart, meaning that you can send more of the deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and you can send more of the oxygenated blood back repressurized into the systemic circuit. But you will notice on this that you still have a connection between the two circuits of blood after they leave the ventricles. In particular, you have a shunt that occurs either in the upper end of the ventricle on turtle, snakes, and lizards, or in the aortas in crocodiles. Now this is super cool because it means you actually have 3 circuits for circulation through the body, although the 2 systemic circuits connect up before they make it back to the heart. So when reptiles are in low oxygen conditions, or when they're not being very active and they don't need a lot of oxygen, they will actually close this specialized valve that allows blood normally to go to the lungs and force more of the blood to go into these 2 systemic circuits, thereby not wasting your time by pumping blood through the lungs. Okay, and this lecture will be where we stop with discussions of the anatomy and comparative anatomy of the circulatory system in the heart in vertebrates. And so we'll just end with the 4-chambered heart and completely separate systemic and pulmonary circuits of birds and mammals, including us. You'll remember how when I talked about amphibians that I said that they can really get away from water in the adult life, particularly toads, which have this sort of drier, harder external skin. But that they always need water or at least moist environments for reproduction. Well, reptiles now remove that constraint, and they do so by the means of the evolution on this branch of the amniotic egg. Now, one of the main features of the amniotic egg is it has this external shell that forms a protective layer. Protective both from mechanical disturbance and also from desiccation. Now, it can be leathery or brittle. It's leathery in most of the reptiles, but it's brittle in birds, like the eggshell of a bird. But the cool thing about this is that gases can pass through it. So water can't pass through it, but gases can. So you can still obtain oxygen from the environment and off-gas carbon dioxide from the developing embryo, but you won't let water out. So you can maintain a moist environment for development of the embryo within the shell while allowing respiration to occur. It's a little bit like Gore-Tex. Here are some of the features of the amniotic egg. In particular, you have that external shell, and then you have albumin within that, which is providing cushion but also moisture for the embryo. And then within that, you have some extra embryonic membranes outside the embryo itself, including the chorion, which surrounds pretty much everything other than the albumin, and that is allowing gas exchange as well. And then you have 3 different membranes within the chorion. One of those is the amnion, that's containing the embryo itself. Another one is the yolk sac, that's containing the nutrients that the embryo is going to use to fuel its development. And then you have the allantois, which contains waste products. You're still going to have waste within the developing embryo because it's metabolizing the yolk in order to fuel its development. And so if that's the case, where do you put the waste? You can't be pooping into your own environment. So they have this specialized membrane that contains that waste. Now, because of the external shell in particular in this group, you can't have external fertilization. So most of the groups you saw so far, except for some of the salamanders, fertilization occurs outside the mother. So they lay the egg and then males fertilize it. But here now you need to bake this shell, and this shell is also impermeable to sperm. So what has to happen is that the egg has to be fertilized, and then the female builds the shell and adds the albumin once they're fertilized inside the female's oviduct. So inside that membrane, you can't basically have a highly toxic substance that requires lots of water. That would be an extreme waste. Now, there's many things that have to be voided from the body. These include salts and ions, and these can be reduced by the skin or the gills or the kidneys or specialized glands. Remember in the introductory video, you see the marine iguana snorting out salt. So that's another way of getting rid of ions out of the body. You also sometimes need to get rid of water if you have too much inside your body, and you need to get rid of fecal matter released from your digestive system. But what we want to concentrate on now is nitrogenous wastes. So these are the product of protein and DNA metabolism. They have a lot of nitrogen in them, and nitrogen can form toxic compounds that you just need to get out of the body. The wastes of carbohydrate and fat metabolism are carbon dioxide and water, whereas with proteins and nucleic acids, you also have the release of this lots of nitrogen. Now, this nitrogen is often generated and converted into three different forms of waste, nitrogenous waste. One is ammonia, then you have urea, and finally uric acid, which is what we're going to emphasize when it comes to the reptiles in the amniotic egg. Now, ammonia, so as NH3, is very soluble in water, but it's also very toxic. So it needs to be diluted and disposed of quickly or converted to a less toxic form, such as urea or uric acid in some organisms. Now, the things that excrete ammonia include rayed fin fishes, marine and freshwater, aquatic invertebrates, and also larval amphibians. So this is another way in which larval and adult amphibians differ. And something that changes during the metamorphic process is that they stop excreting ammonia and then use a different nitrogenous waste. Now, ammonia is very toxic, as this notes here, and so if you're in an aquatic environment, it's quite easy to get rid of it just by peeing into the environment, and then the solution to pollution is dilution. It just sort of diffuses away. But if you keep aquatic organisms in very enclosed spaces with relatively little amounts of water, they're basically peeing into their own water. And this is why fish can't persist for a long period of time in a small amount of water. Now, another form of nitrogenous waste is urea. Urea is soluble in water. It's a little bit toxic, but it's not as bad as ammonia. And less water is needed for disposal relative to ammonia. So with ammonia, you saw that those were aquatic organisms, and aquatic organisms tend not to be limited by water, obviously, and so they can produce a nitrogenous waste that requires a lot of water to get rid of. But now you have organisms, at least some of them, that are outside of the water, such as adult amphibians and mammals like us. Also, cartilaginous fishes use urea. Now, the final nitrogenous waste that I use to motivate this discussion of nitrogenous waste and excretions is uric acid. Now, it's insoluble in water, so this is why bird poop can't be washed easily off cars, because it's not soluble with water. If you look at places where birds have been pooping or peeing, you see white material, and that's partly uric acid, and it's really hard to wash off. So it's not soluble in water, but the great thing is it's not toxic, and it doesn't need much water for disposal, for disposal. So this means that it's really good for the amniotic egg, and it's used also by insects and by reptiles and birds. Now, within vertebrates, this excretion is done by the kidney in all of the vertebrates. And the function of the kidney then is to regulate levels of water and dissolved solute in the blood. And sort of, to a crude sense, it filters the blood and removes the stuff you don't want, forming urine, which then is excreted. Now, I could spend a whole bunch of time talking about the specific detailed features of the kidney. For example, it's got a cool countercurrent system that we've discussed before in the context of the gills acquiring oxygen from the environment. But I've just tried to distill it down to some of the key features that are necessary for telling the broader picture. Now, here's a representation of how it works. So basically, you have the blood coming in, and then it goes into this little glomerulus that is inside the Bowman's capsule. And in essence, pressure forces much of the blood, some of the blood, out into the Bowman's capsule, which then moves into the renal tubule and then goes back down through another part of the kidney where it comes back alongside the blood vessels again. And when that happens, you have active excretion of some more things out of the blood, but you have resorption of some things that you need back into the blood. And then the blood goes back to the rest of the body and the urine comes out. So just take a second to think about how much blood you think is in the human body. And if you picked 5 liters, you would be correct. Which then begs the question of how much blood goes through the kidney every single day? So what do you think? Well, the answer is always C, right? So it's 2,000 liters. So that means that there's a lot of blood that's passing through the kidney. The difficulty of doing this process can be best illustrated by the vampire bat. So there's a cute little vampire bat there. Now, I learned this from a book called Dark Banquet by Bill Shutt, who's a biologist. It's a really, really cool book. And it's all about blood feeding things. So here's the way vampires bats work, is they sneak up at night to something and they sort of cuddle up underneath a bird or a mammal, humans included, and nibble a little hole, and then they lap up the blood. Now they have to feed really quickly, and they fill their gut full of all this blood. The first major problem is that they have to fly away, right? So you can't have all this weight within your gut. So initially what the kidney does right away is it excretes really rapidly the water. Vampire bats pee while they feed, which is pretty crazy. Now here's the thing. Blood is super rich in nitrogen. So if you're a blood feeder, you have to get rid of this without now losing too much water to dehydrate. So the kidneys completely change their physiology, and now all of a sudden they're excreting very highly concentrated urine. Now the switchover from excreting tons of water initially to excreting almost no water and instead highly concentrated urea occurs on a very short time frame. So the vampire bat's kidneys are the coolest kidneys that you can imagine.